Hello, my name is James Cranfield from Insight Consultancy, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about network fees. No, please don't switch off, you might find it interesting. Network fees, what are they? The charges that are charged by Visa and MasterCard, for example. We're not talking about interchange here, but we're talking about network fees. Quite a difficult subject to get your head around sometimes, especially if you're not working in that field. And even those who've been working in the field of network fees for a long time still sometimes struggle to understand some of the concepts behind network fees. So I'm going to give a very, very quick demonstration and a talk through of what network fees are and where they come from and why they are structured in the way they are structured. Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about interchange here, I'm talking about network fees. There's an important distinction between interchange fees and network fees, in that interchange fees are not collected by the payment schemes and they're not charged by them as revenue. So in other words, they're passed through by issuers to acquirers and vice versa. In fact, point of sale interchange is mainly paid by acquirers to issuers. ATM interchange, also known as cash advance service fees, are paid the other way around. But interchange is out of the scope of this discussion here. Interchange is not collected by the payment schemes like Visa and MasterCard. They're not a revenue to them. We're talking about network fees. So the fees that you'll be familiar with, things like authorization, clearing and settlement fees, for example, that Visa and MasterCard charge. So that's what we're looking at here. And we're trying to get an idea of the complexity and why they are so complex. And they weren't always complex. 50 or 60 years ago, they were very simple fees, a percentage-based transaction and a fixed amount. And then more recently, they've moved to much more complex fee structures. To give you an example of that, back in 1994, when I was working for one of the networks, the European fee manual was less than 50 pages long. The equivalent European fee manual today is about 55,000 pages long, and that's because there are about 30 different manuals for one per country, and there are 3 manuals for each country because they split those into things like switching, fees, brand fees, and also they have a third one for standalone. So it's much more complex than it was back in the day, and that's been changing over the years, and we might see it go full circle a little bit. Are they important? Well, yes, they are important. If you look at the last most recent publications by Visa and MasterCard, their annual reports, they report something like 40 billion in annual fees. So they are significant and they are important. They can represent up to 0.5% of issue and acquirer combined fee levels in some regions. And now, of course, that's split between issuers and acquirers. So you might have 0.3% for issuers and 0.2% for acquirers. That would be very high, but don't forget this is not an average. This is saying it can be up to that. In Europe, for example, you'd expect it to be about a third of that, so about 0.15, 0.17, and the majority of it paid by issuers and some of it paid by acquirers. But it can depend on the nature of the business. So if you're paying something like 5 basis points as an acquirer, that might be normal. If you were paying 15 basis points as an issuer, that might be normal. So it really depends very much on your mix of business as well. But why did it get so complex, and why is it as complex as it is today? And that's because, well, it's always been split by activity. So you paid a different rate whether you're an issuer or acquirer. But as you can see here, you also pay different rates according to the geography. So if you have a domestic transaction, they tend to be cheaper. Intra-regional transactions and inter-regional transactions, they're both international transactions, tend to be more expensive. Within that intra-regional section, you may have different levels of sub-regions within the intra-regional section. So just to add more complexity to it. So that's only in the European region, for example, you have that. And both schemes differ, both networks differ in the way that they define those sub-regions as well. You might have an EEA region, a Western region, Eastern region, for example. Those sub-regions, you have different fees when you have transactions that go between those regions, just to add a layer of complexity. And it's not just to add a layer of complexity, there are good reasons behind having those fees. Business units, this is something that the schemes didn't necessarily want to introduce, but were forced to introduce in Europe, certainly by regulation. So you can see here that we have business units, and they've been forced to divide their fees, and in fact their whole division or structure, into scheme, processing and standalone. Scheme and processing have always been quite distinct in the pricing manuals and bulletins, but now they have to have 3 independent fee manuals to describe each of those, so it can add complexity. By product as well, credit, debit, and prepaid, for example, consumer, commercial, they'll all have different rates. And this was started back in the 90s, where rather than have one fee for all, the payment scheme started unbundling their fees, and I was partly responsible for that back in the mid 90s, as I was responsible for unbundling very simple fee structure and making it more complicated but more fair. So it's a bit like tax. The more fair you want to make taxation, almost necessarily the more complex it's going to be. And what we were doing is we were adopting a user pays principle. So if you didn't use authorizations, you didn't pay for authorizations, you just paid for clearing. If you didn't use clearing, you didn't you did your own processing, you didn't have to pay for that. So we unbundled it to make it fairer, but by doing that, we made it more complex. And of course, it's extremely complex today, especially because we also adopted some stepped and tiered mechanisms, which means that rather than pay a flat fee, you pay according to the volumes. And that was really to get around cross-subsidization. We didn't want a huge issuer having to pay the same fee as a small startup issuer, because there were economies of scale that should be shared across the network. And that was the most effective way to do that. But actually, those tiered structures and those step structures are starting to disappear now as well. We're seeing a lot of less formal rebates being put in place by both networks. And of course, the transaction type would affect the price as well, the scheme fee that was charged, or the network fee that was charged. So you have lots of good reasons why it's complex, but that doesn't make it any less complicated to understand. So that's the broad structure. And if we have a look in terms of what that means and the calculation types that are adopted, we can see here that actually there are lots of different ways that schemes can charge, and they can do it on a percentage of transaction. They can so it would be, let's say, for example, 0.1% of the sales volume, or it could be an amount per transaction. So it could be a cent per transaction, for example, or more likely 0.1 of a cent per transaction. They can charge based on the ICAs you have, which is the bank identification number, which you'll tend to have one or two ICA numbers, and below that you'll have bins. So you'll have really by product or by program, you'll have a bin number. You can actually charge by bin as well for different types of fees. And then of course there are exceptional items, things like chargebacks and other items and penalty fees, which are charged when things don't necessarily go right. So those are different charges as well. And as you can see, there are different charging methodologies that can be applied. Things like tiering, progressive versus standard tiering. You get caps, you get minimums, and the charging basis can be on the number of transactions that are processed or the reported transactions. And I'll go into that in a second, because that is quite interesting as well, especially when you look at the timing of it. So the timing is interesting because although most scheme invoices are monthly, the charges are applied either weekly, monthly, quarterly, 6 monthly, annually, and ad hoc, in other words, whenever the event happens. So that adds a bit of complexity to understanding and measuring scheme fees. And there's good reasons for that as well. The weekly and the monthly tend to be transactions which are based on the processed transactions, for example, that might go through both networks. But the quarterly charges are a bit of a legacy, because they are charged via the certificates or the returns that are supplied by issuers and acquirers, which you have to report the levels of transactions to both Visa and MasterCard. And they will charge you based on that. And why is that? Why do they need to know that? Well, that's because brand fees, for example, are charged based on the value of the transactions that you have on those cards which have that brand on it, irrespective of whether those transactions were processed by one of the schemes. And is that fair? Well, actually, yes, it is, because these are what you might refer to as franchise fees. So the brands are obviously very expensive to run, and of course you have recognition of those brands down to those campaigns, and that is obviously they're very, very valuable brands. And the reason a transaction may have happened domestically in a market may only have happened because that brand was there. So in other words, if an issuing bank issued their own card and that card was used domestically, but the transaction wasn't processed by one of the big schemes, the transaction still happened because the cardholder recognized that brand at the acceptance point and use their card. So yes, it's fair that they're charged a brand fee for that, and the only way that they can collect the fees based on that is by asking issuers and acquirers to fill out certificates which say how many transactions they did which did not go through the network, as well as those which did go through the network. So those quarterly fees tend to be brand fees and tend to be self-reported. So there are lots of different frequencies of billing and lots of different types of billing and charging methodologies that they apply. So there's quite a significant amount of complexity. Now, the good news is that we can help. We can help with clarify some of this for you, and also dress all these scheme fees up in a nice way so you can see these piles of transactions and reports and invoices that you have, and boil them down to some very meaningful reports and measures and benchmark you to tell you whether you're paying the right level of scheme fees according to how the other issuers and acquirers, what levels they're paying as well. So we're able to do that, and we're also able to give you nice reports. And of course, we're consultants, so we'll turn ugly invoices into very shiny ones, and which will show you how you're trending in terms of basis points, in terms of total scheme fees as a percentage of your total spend, and we'll show you that if there are any anomalies, and occasionally there are mistakes in invoices, honest mistakes I have to say, where a scheme may have charged or undercharged for an element, which they will allow you to look at that and appeal it, and often get refunds based on those errors which are made. But more often than not, it's the issuers and acquirers don't recognize those fees, and they go into a pot, and they may have been something very actionable. They may have been penalty fees where the schemes were expecting you to do something about those fees, but instead they've gone into an operational bucket somewhere, and that could have increased the costs over years. So we're able to pinpoint those. So if you do need help on your scheme fees or network fees, please do let us know. Please contact us, and we'll see how we can help you with our Insight Plus product. I hope that has clarified a little bit about payment schemes, fees and network fees, but please do not hesitate to get in touch with us to see if we can help you. We'd be glad to. Thank you.